Rolling out an enterprise chargeback program is much harder than you would think it should be. It shouldn't be hard to ask people to pay for what they use, right? Group X used application Y, so they should pay Z. Sounds simple enough. Well, the practice of getting teams to adopt and pay for a distributed cost program for shared assets is not as simple as it sounds. Hi, I'm Stephen Fishman, and I lead the MuleSoft Customer Success Strategy discipline. In this video, I'll break down the main friction points in setting up a chargeback program, along with how to create a model that's primed for enterprise adoption. Welcome to Friends of Max. Many organizations struggle with getting a chargeback model accepted by distributed and autonomous teams. I've worked in or with enterprises trying to get a low-effort, easy to onboard, and simple to understand model, and it's not that envisioning the model is so difficult, it's the adoption problem. Nobody wants to do the cost accounting work, nobody wants to allocate budgets for things they don't control, and everybody wants to continue the free ride. Let's break down the obstacles and then make a plan to get around them to free up your development teams to get busy on adding value to your enterprise and its customers. What makes chargeback so hard to formalize in a distributed enterprise? While every enterprise has unique characteristics and challenges, there are still three common friction points that keep a shared platform team from advancing. 1, an unhealthy obsession with precision. 2, an over-rotated bias on local control. And 3, the lack of a model that accounts for reuse. First, we'll cover friction point number 1, an unhealthy obsession with precision. Coming up with a precise cost to serve model to drive bills that are accurate to the penny or dollar tends to be a source of significant friction in distributed enterprises. Should we consider operational staffing costs, ancillary software costs? How should we treat the cost of reservation versus the cost of consumption? How should we consider funding of architectural runway? Most everyone understands that for external monetization, cost-based pricing is not a good idea because it leaves money on the table. In external use cases, value-based pricing is the name of the game. For internal use cases, on the other hand, the economics are often reversed because the goal is adoption of a shared set of assets and capabilities rather than profit. In this context, a critical first step for program adoption is to frame chargeback as a partial cost recovery tool. In other words, don't have an intention of covering the full cost to serve a request, at least not out of the gate, because a precise cost to serve computation requires a lot of cost accounting work that covers operational staff, ancillary software, architectural runway, allocating headroom for usage spikes, and other items that your application consumers and creators don't really care about. When you get your organization aligned to a model of partial or significant cost recovery, the economics and incentives begin to align with the actual goal of adoption, specifically because creating and consuming teams will receive more value than they are paying for. If you roll out your service and model to internal stakeholders and someone asks for a breakdown of the bill, you can start with, here's what you aren't paying for, which then makes consumption costs and any dependency concerns easier to swallow. Now let's talk about friction point number 2, an over-rotated bias on local control. Balancing the concerns of a large enterprise with those of consuming groups is difficult when individual and team goals are aligned and integrated into compensation systems. Why should a consuming group divert their budget to fund a shared service when they can keep the funding and direct the outcome themselves? How can leaders and teams prioritize and commit to shared efforts when the benefits aren't realized in a single-year financial model? In a home or maintenance improvement project, whenever you get a quote on work from a contractor, you're very likely to ask yourself whether it would be better to do it yourself rather than to pay someone else. Your target customers are doing the same thing. When you ask a decision maker to commit funds for anything, a calculation happens in their head where they compare what you are asking for to the cost of doing the task themselves within their own teams. Nobody likes being dependent upon systems that they have little to no control over, much less having to pay for the privilege of dependency without control. To overcome this objection, you will need to put some focused energy towards defining and instrumenting an aligned set of value metrics. For example, time to value, development operational costs, and/or quality factors. Developing a set of infographics and information radiators to communicate your value proposition will help your partners see the compelling opportunities of a shared platform. It's critical to remember that data beats math when trying to change status quo behaviors. You may not like it, but the burden of proof is on you to show the value in hard quantifiable terms to give your decision makers confidence that aligning to an enterprise solution will be the right play. Just like a dieting or exercise infomercial on TV, You'll need to show before and after pictures of real people to give your partners a reason to believe. I know that many engineering teams struggle to find time to develop a set of ubiquitous dashboards that make work visible. If this is true for your team, please check out our blogs and videos on getting started with MuleSoft's freely available metrics accelerator. The last friction point we're going to cover in this video is the lack of a model that accounts for reuse. Developing a chargeback model that accounts for the enterprise value of reuse is difficult given that reuse is often organic and not predictable. Why should a producing group share capabilities when potential customers don't pay for the capacity or compute? Why should an architect stray from fit for purpose to plan and design for customers who don't exist yet? How can producing groups recoup the cost of development, operations, maintenance, etc. when others reuse their assets? Let's say you own the budget for an application development effort and someone asks you to design and plan for the assets you're making to be reused by other teams in the enterprise. Furthermore, you just don't own the development budget, you also own the carrying cost for the infrastructure that will host the application. You get the privilege of allocating your product development budget and time for the benefit of others, while you also get to experience the joy of hosting a solution that others leverage for their business objectives that you don't share the benefits of. Does that sound like a good deal to you? To get past this last friction point, we can borrow a trick from old school telephony known as calling party pays. Calling party pays is a telephony term that refers to a charging method that US-based phone companies use to drive cellular adoption. By introducing a structure that relieved phone owners of being responsible for the cost of others calling them, they took a major objection for phone ownership off the table. If your team doesn't create a structure to recoup the cost of compute and/or the cost of designing a reusable component, the altruistic incentives to create and share reusable componentry just aren't strong enough to overcome local optimization behaviors. A key nuance in setting this up is that the referencing client ID of the calling party is not sufficient because the client ID of the calling party in an API-led ecosystem isn't necessarily the instigator of the request. In an API-led infrastructure where API calls are nested from experience to process to system, you'll need to identify the root caller, which is often not an API at all. It might be a web page, a mobile app, or some other system in your portfolio of applications. To that end, the Mule4 runtime supports the use of correlation IDs as a configurable part of the platform, with the insertion of a custom correlation ID that is made up of a business group ID to identify the original calling party and a GUID to uniquely identify the request. Each subsequent application request will carry along with it the same correlation ID that can then be used to create a usage bill where usage is allocated by the original root caller. Once you've gotten past the 3 friction points, the last task is creating a bill to distribute to your consumers. To jumpstart your efforts to create an automated billing process, the MuleSoft team has published a working prototype of a billing solution that's free to download and use. So if we look back at the wants and needs of the actors and audiences in your API ecosystem, we can see how smoothing out the 3 friction points will accelerate efforts to roll out a chargeback program that people would readily adopt. For creators, the platform is already paid for, inclusive of ancillary costs. Consumers pay for what they use. For consumers, the platform and components are already paid for, inclusive of ancillary costs. And for them individually, they only pay for what they use at a lower rate than a cost to serve. For operators and governors, billing is push button and only requires some definition up front to model and process. Once a chargeback structure has been created and adopted by teams, the financial operating model of your shared platform will be much more aligned with the enterprise goals on reusable componentry, driving speed throughout your SDLC processes. If you're having trouble getting your transformation program into acceleration mode, consider calling the MuleSoft team to help you unlock and reuse your enterprise assets by aligning the interests of your distributed teams. Thanks for your time, and please stay tuned for more helpful videos on API topics of all types from Friends of Max.